This is Module 5 of Legal Research. And in this module, we are looking at the concept of research ethics, which is something that is connected to but different from legal professional ethics. And as you'll see from the readings, there is a long history of concern around the potential harm that research can do to research subjects. And part of the aim of a research ethics process is to mitigate those harms. So any research that's done through a public organisation, such as a university or a grant or a hospital, and to a lesser extent public justice bodies, although they are still have their own ethical concerns, the process tends to be less formal. But in any of those more established research bodies, there is a process where you seek consent from an ethical body or an ethics committee to conduct a particular type of research, in which you disclose what research you want to do and what your methods are going to be, and you anticipate what potential risks might be involved. And that's an important part of this process, and one of the core aspects of an ethics process is risk mitigation, something which as lawyers we are trained to think about. Doesn't mean we're necessarily going to be any better at it than other researchers, but we are familiar with that sort of language and that sort of idea. So it's not about 100% harm prevention, it's about risk mitigation, as with any kind of decision making that has a legal or ethical component at the end of the day. So particularly when you think about research that's involving, say, health issues, or in our field, anything that's involving criminal behaviour or people in the justice system, the ethics process is not really about saying, oh, there are too many risks, we can't go ahead, but it's about foreseeing the risks and making sure the risks are handled, because anything involving people's health, liberty, and rights, there are always going to be risks. So the ethics process is about keeping a handle on those risks and not saying, well, we can foresee some situation where this could go wrong, and therefore we won't do the research. Rather, we say we foresee situations where it could go wrong, and this is what we'll do to mitigate that harm or to try and stop that harm occurring in the first place. So there are really two sides to the coin when you're thinking about research ethics. One is this risk mitigation aspect of, and that often gets into arguments about what the liability of the institution is, in terms of, are we being negligent with our research? Are we going to be responsible for the consequences of this research? But there's also another side which is not so often looked at, which is the concept of public good. So is it enough that we just don't do any harm, or should we be positively obliged to actually do good? Should our research actually achieve something good in society? And that's more contentious, and part of that, of course, is because everyone has a different opinion as to what's good and what's not. But I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well, and certainly as part of the law reform process, that's hard-coded into the law reform process, into the governing legislation of the bodies, that it is not just about finding out information about what's going on, it's about achieving a social good and making a change for the better. Alright, so the materials this week look at the actual process of obtaining the ethics for human research, and we'll have a look at some of the paperwork that's involved in, because there's always paperwork. As you are an undergraduate student, you won't be doing any human research. There's a potential, if you go on to honours, that you may end up doing some surveys and those sort of things, but most of the time we don't, except in some circumstances. I think psychology does a little bit, but most times universities are not willing to let undergrad students out there in the public, where they can, potentially do harm to members of the public. And these days, even relatively minor forms of research, universities are quite paranoid about harm. So it's not about going out there and interviewing victims of sexual assault, where you can clearly see how much danger there is of unskilled researcher doing harm to that person. But even just a survey of people on the street and that sort of thing, which used to be a commonplace thing that universities would send students out, go and ask people down at the local shopping centre what they think about the rates of burglary in the area, or the kind of sentencing that's handed out. It used to happen all the time, and now universities have clamped down a lot on that. In case you just happen to get interview that one person who was burgled last week, and they have sort of a mental break, and suddenly the university's being sued. So it is a weird time, and I think it's a weird time that is of interest to us as lawyers as well as researchers, because the idea of researchers doing good, which came out of the initial ethics processes in the wake of things like the Nazi experiments, has been replaced by this fear of being sued. And, I'll leave you to have a think, discuss amongst yourselves, and to think for yourself whether you think it's more important that people do the right thing because it's the right thing, or they do it because they think they're going to be punished by someone else. And that's a core question for criminology and justice studies in any case. Alright, so in the workshop this week we will work through what is called the low-risk research documentation for a low-risk ethics application, and it'll give you an idea of the sorts of things that you would do if you worked in the research field. The other aspect of this is, I think, that's very important, is as a researcher who uses the research of other people, you need to understand that research has been through an ethics approval process. So that shapes and constrains the kind of research questions that are asked and the kinds of methodologies that are going to be used. And that becomes more important as the weeks go on when we look at data sources for research. So sometimes when you read research and you think, well, in this circumstance, why didn't they just ask this person, or why didn't they just get the basic information about that? Well, sometimes that question is about the ethical constraints, and those ethical constraints determine the kind of research that you can do. So that's the focus this week. In terms of housekeeping, assignment 1 is coming up, and what you'll find is that there'll be lots of questions asked on Teams about specific things about people's research questions and what to do. And there's a little trap here that I want to raise and have you think really carefully about. And that trap is, the more people ask me, the lecturer, questions, and the more information I give out, the more complicated the process seems to be. Now, this is not a complicated assignment at all. It's basically about you saying, this is my plan, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going ahead. And one way to think about it is, think about it if you were working for me. I mean, fancy you being paid to do this, and I was your boss, and I was giving you this project to do, and I said, give me an update on where you're at and where you're going, so I can sign it off and I can give you some feedback on it. I think that's the simplest way to think about it. There's no set format, there's no magic solution. It's about you thinking about what you're going to do, how you're going to approach it, what the elements of the question are, and giving me and via proxy the markers an update on where you're going. And it's really about you getting your head in order at this stage. In some ways, the actual assessment part of the task is less relevant. It's about that internal process you go through of going, okay, let's sort everything out. Okay, but as time goes on, and just specifically during this week, people will be asking me lots of questions and I'll be giving them certain answers. And the tendency for some people will be to get overwhelmed by the amount of information and then to go into a panic spiral. And you may recognize this phenomenon amongst yourself or within yourself. And it happens around assignment times, and the more people are saying, well, what about this, what about this, and what about this, the more complicated the answer gets, or seems to get, because you're taking in the information that's relevant to other people and not just to you. And if you're feeling a little insecure about what you're doing and feeling a little lacking in confidence, and it's natural as a beginner to be feeling lacking in confidence. It's probably much worse to be totally confident in what you do, because it probably means you're not thinking hard enough. But if you're feeling a little that you're lacking a little in confidence, then suddenly it can seem like the answer has become very, very complicated and everyone else seems to know what's going on and I don't know what's going on, and to go into panic mode. So that's something I can't fix for you. That's something you need to think about and address for yourself. I can give you feedback. I can have a chat with you. Can do all those things, but recognize that that's a phenomenon. So in the appendix for last week's workshop, there were certain guides. There was more information about, here are some of the things you could do with your plan, and that comes out of several years of students asking me questions about what could I do, how could I include theory, and so on. But again, every time you read another piece of guidance, that task becomes more complicated, or seems to become more complicated, because there's more information. So think simplicity, think back to the basics, think about what you need to actually do, which is actually show me where you're at and where you're going, and that's the core of what it's about. And that does connect into the equilibrium aspect of this week, which is about the importance of being good to yourself and maintaining that sort of well-being as part of the your study process, and not letting yourself slide into those sort of cycles and panics and fretting, because you can do more good in actually doing something than worrying about it. And that's easier said than done, I know. But that's an important issue in life, is you can spend 2 weeks worrying about how hard a task is, and those 2 weeks you could spend actually doing the task, and the task would be done. And you may not be satisfied with the task, but at least you've done it, and at least you've used that energy in a way that's focused on getting something done. So hopefully this is only of minor importance to you, and you say, hey, I have a little tendency to do that. I do tend to freak out when assignments are due. I do tend to go to the forums and suddenly read what everyone says, and if there's Facebook groups out there, someone in the Facebook group will say something outrageous, and that'll cause like a panic reaction, and you can map those using data. You can watch those panic reactions when someone, 2 days before an assignment's due, either negligently or maliciously says, oh, well, I'm doing this for my assignment, and suddenly everyone starts going, well, I must be doing something wrong, and then suddenly there's this mass panic erupts. So just be aware of those things, be aware of your own responses to them, and be able to say to yourself, look, yes, this is a natural reaction to this, but I need to be in control of that, because I can't live my whole life being constantly panicked and spooked by every deadline or objective I get, because that will burn you out and that will kill you. And this is one of those problems with the legal profession. Don't want to go too far into this in a quick intro video, but at one point I was interviewing barristers, and the number of barristers who say that they get so worried that they're physically sick before they go into court. And you think, well, that's no way to live your life. Yeah, having a sense of performance anxiety can be quite good, because you can actually heighten the performance by going, yeah, I'm really sort of wired up to do this. But living your life every week doing your job makes you sick is just not a way to go. And some of those habits we get into this early in our study habits, and we get into by the way we react and deal with the stress at this stage. So, I don't want to. It's a bit of a diversion from the task, but it's probably a good time in the term to talk about that, and to think about, if you are in those sort of destructive patterns, to think about talking to someone, to think about talking about ways of getting help and ways of managing that. All right, the only other point I had in my notes here was the readings for this week is the guidelines for the national guidelines for responsible conduct of research. I don't expect you to read every sentence and every clause and every paragraph of that document, but it's good to get a general overview of that, and to also think about regulatory documents, because this is a piece of regulation, not legislation, and to think about the differences and similarities between those forms of document. There's a lot more similarities than there are differences, but think about the different tasks that a piece of legislation has in governing behaviour, and a regulation such as a code of conduct like this one has. And that's interesting stuff in terms of what lawyers are and what they do. So it's more than just administering law. It's these days we have unprecedented growth of our regulatory structures and our regulatory documents like this one, and we're more and more called upon to actually be those who guide and interpret codes of conduct and other forms of regulation. Okay, well, that's what I've had to say for now, and I will see you again in class this week.